What if one of the most quoted promises of Jesus has been understood only halfway? Matthew 7. And 7 remembered as ask, and you shall receive. Yet Jesus did not leave his listeners standing still with an unanswered request. He immediately moved them from asking to seeking, and finally to knocking at a door. Inside that progression is an ancient pattern that becomes even more revealing when we return to the Aramaic-speaking world in which his message was first heard. Shal, pronounced shal, means to ask, request, or inquire. But asking was only the first movement of something much greater. What follows is not a formula for controlling reality, but a transformation from passive expectation into spiritual participation. And once you see why Jesus placed these three commands together, Matthew 7 may never sound passive again. For centuries, most Christians came to know the teachings of Jesus through translations based primarily on Greek manuscripts, while the Aramaic-speaking world surrounding his earthly life gradually became less familiar to ordinary believers. Then, in 1945, near Nag Hammadi in Egypt, ancient manuscripts buried for centuries were discovered, including early Christian and Gnostic writings that had never entered the biblical canon. Those manuscripts did not reveal a secret Aramaic version of Matthew 7:7, nor do they prove that the Church deliberately suppressed the original Aramaic commands of Jesus. What their discovery demonstrated with historical force was that early Christianity contained a wider landscape of texts, interpretations, and spiritual traditions than generations of believers had commonly encountered. That matters, because recovering the world of Jesus requires more than opening an English Bible and assuming that every translated word carries exactly the same associations as the language spoken around him. The Gospel of Matthew has been preserved in Greek, but Jesus lived within a predominantly Aramaic-speaking environment where words were connected to everyday experience, relationship, action, and oral teaching. Hebrew remained important in Scripture and religious worship, while Greek was widely used throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world. Yet Aramaic was intimately connected with ordinary life in Galilee and Judea, making it essential for understanding the linguistic environment in which many teachings, confrontations, blessings, and healings of Jesus took place. This is also why sacred Aramaic words can feel different when spoken aloud rather than merely translated on a page. In ancient oral cultures, meaning was carried through breath, rhythm, emphasis, memory, and intention, so the spoken word was experienced rather than treated simply as information. Some spiritual traditions describe this experience as vibration or energetic resonance, and others poetically describe sacred language as awakening an ancient memory within us, even reconnecting us with our original design or original DNA. These are spiritual metaphors rather than established biological mechanisms, but they express something meaningful. Ancient words can interrupt familiar patterns and make us hear an old teaching as though we were encountering it again. And this brings us directly to the first Aramaic key. Shal, pronounced shal, means to ask, request, inquire, or question. But the power of Matthew 7:7 appears when we refuse to separate this first command from the two commands that immediately follow it. Jesus does not describe someone asking repeatedly while remaining motionless. He creates a progression in which asking awakens intention, seeking gives that intention, direction, and knocking eventually brings the seeker face-to-face to the threshold. Imagine the movement contained inside the passage. At first, the person recognizes a need and asks. Then that same person begins searching. And eventually the search brings them close enough to a door that they can reach forward and knock. This means the familiar promise contains something far more challenging than passive wishing. Asking may begin the journey, but Jesus immediately calls the person who asks into deeper participation with what they are asking for. Perhaps this is the first hidden lesson of Matthew 7:7. The question is not merely whether you have asked God for something, but whether your request has begun changing where you look, how you listen, and which doors you are willing to approach. Imagine someone standing on a dark road asking for shelter while a light burns in a house farther ahead. The person can continue repeating the request from a distance, but eventually asking must become movement if they are ever going to reach the illuminated doorway. That image helps us understand why Matthew 7:7 does not end with the first command. Jesus tells his listeners to ask, but immediately afterward he tells them to seek. and then he leads them all the way to the action of knocking. This progression becomes especially important when we examine the way scarcity influences prayer. Scarcity does not merely say, "I need something." It can convince us that what we need is permanently separated from us, and that we possess no meaningful responsibility for the next step. Someone may pray for reconciliation while continually avoiding the conversation that reconciliation requires. Another person may ask for purpose while dismissing the small responsibilities already appearing before them, waiting instead for one spectacular sign that removes every uncertainty. Someone may ask for wisdom but resist every answer that challenges an old belief. Another may pray for opportunity every morning while never approaching the doors through which an opportunity could actually emerge. This does not make prayer unnecessary. It reveals why the sequence taught by Jesus is so powerful. Prayer awakens the request, but the request begins transforming the person when it influences attention, discernment, persistence, and action. Return again to shells, pronounced sha dashal, meaning to ask, request, or inquire. When shell is isolated from the rest of Matthew 7-7, asking can sound like the entire spiritual process. But when it remains connected to seeking and knocking, it becomes the beginning of a journey. The person who asks becomes attentive to what might answer the request. The attentive person begins seeking, and the seeker eventually recognizes a threshold that was invisible while they remained standing at a distance. This is where the teaching touches the idea of abundance without turning prayer into a technique for commanding reality. Spiritual abundance begins with relationship and trust, while scarcity continually interprets silence, delay, and uncertainty as evidence of abandonment. The sequence of Jesus offers another response. Ask honestly, then become attentive enough to seek, and remain engaged long enough to recognize when the journey has brought you before a door. Perhaps some answers arrive differently from what we expected because the answer is not merely an object placed into our hands. Sometimes the journey toward the answer develops courage, discernment, patience, humility, or responsibility that did not exist when the request first began. This is why understanding the ancient linguistic world behind these teachings can open dimensions that familiar translations no longer make us notice. Once a verse becomes familiar, we stop asking why each word was placed where it was, and the progression can disappear behind the quotation. If this teaching already feels this deep, imagine having a full guide with deeper explanations of Jesus's true teachings in Aramaic. You'll find the link to the Aramaic Wisdom Guide in the comments. And there is still something hidden inside the second command that changes everything we have uncovered so far. When asking becomes seeking, the person is no longer simply waiting for an answer. Something inside the seeker has already begun to move toward it. And the best is yet to come. In the next chapters, you'll discover what could change everything for you. The second movement of Matthew 7-7 takes us beyond asking, because Jesus does not merely invite the listener to express a desire. He directs that desire toward a search. This is where we encounter bayou, pronounced approximately bayuo, carrying the idea of seeking, searching, or pursuing. The important point is not simply learning another ancient word, but recognizing what happens to the person when salal becomes bayou. When you ask, you identify what matters. When you seek, you begin reorganizing your attention around it. The answer may not immediately appear, but you are no longer standing in exactly the same inner position you occupied before the request was made. Consider someone praying for direction while expecting a complete map to appear before taking the first step. Seeking asks that person to become attentive to conversations, responsibilities, opportunities, corrections, and even closed doors that may gradually reveal a direction that could never have been understood in advance. This is where the ancient pattern challenges scarcity, because scarcity continually stares at what is missing. Seeking turns attention toward what is available now, and asks what can be learned, developed, changed, or approached with what has already been placed in your hands. That does not mean every desire will be fulfilled exactly as imagined, nor that every event is a hidden sign from God. It means prayer can create a posture of attentiveness in which the person becomes increasingly capable of recognizing possibilities that fear previously prevented them from seeing. The transformation is subtle but profound. You begin by asking for courage, yet seeking may lead you toward the very situation where courage must be practiced. You ask for wisdom, yet seeking may bring you into contact with a truth that requires you to abandon an old assumption. This is why Jesus does not allow the teaching to end at desire. Asking without seeking can remain an intention forever, while seeking introduces participation and gradually reveals whether what we claim to desire is something we are actually prepared to pursue. And then the progression becomes even more demanding, because Bayou is still not the final movement. The seeker eventually reaches something that cannot be crossed merely by looking, thinking, or waiting. There is a door ahead, and the final Aramaic image will reveal what happens when faith moves close enough to touch the threshold. A dora is different from a distant destination because once you are standing before it, the journey becomes personal. You can see the threshold, perhaps even imagine what lies beyond it, but something is still required from you before the possibility on the other side can become an encounter. This brings us to the third movement, Qushu, pronounced approximately kushu, carrying the sense of knocking, after shala, asking, and Bayou, seeking. Jesus completes the progression with an action that requires the seeker to come close enough to make contact. Notice how beautifully the entire passage moves. The first command begins within desire, the second directs attention outward into pursuit, and the third places your hand against the door that the journey has finally brought before you. Knocking requires something that asking from a distance does not. Vulnerability. Once you knock, you acknowledge that you have arrived at a threshold. But you also accept that opening the door is not entirely under your control. This distinction protects the teaching from becoming a formula for manifestation in which human desire supposedly commands God or reality. The person knocks, but the text says the door will be opened. There is participation on one side of the threshold and reception on the other. That is a very different form of spiritual authority. Authority is not controlling every outcome. It is refusing to remain paralyzed when faith, wisdom, and responsibility have brought you to the place where action is required. Perhaps your door is a conversation you have postponed for years. Perhaps it is submitting the application, beginning the work, asking forgiveness, changing a destructive habit, or finally accepting that an old path has ended and another must begin. You can pray beside that door for months while never touching it. But knocking changes your relationship with possibility. This is where Matthew 7:7 becomes a blueprint for movement rather than a slogan about receiving. Shall gives language to the desire. Bayou turns desire into a search. And Qushu brings the search into contact with a real threshold. And now we can understand why the familiar translation can sound smaller when these movements are separated. The promise was never an invitation to spiritual passivity. The sequence itself calls the listener toward trust, expressed through participation. Right now, you might be asking yourself, why am I only discovering this truth now? Don't worry, we thought about that. We're here to help you go deeper with a guide made for this journey. The link is in the comments. Because there is still one final question. What happens inside you? While you ask, seek, and knock, that transformation may be the deepest form of receiving in the entire passage. Perhaps the greatest revelation in Matthew 7:7 is not simply that something can be received, but that the person who reaches the door is no longer identical to the person who first began asking. Between the request and the threshold, something has been developing within the seeker. This is why the sequence taught by Jesus deserves to be experienced as one continuous movement. Shall awakens the question, Bayou directs attention toward the search, and Qushu brings that search into contact with a threshold where courage and trust must finally become action. Think about what happens internally during that journey. Asking requires honesty about what you need. Seeking requires enough humility to admit that you may not yet know the path. And knocking requires courage to act without possessing complete control over what happens afterward. This is almost the opposite of scarcity. Scarcity continually demands certainty before movement, while trust allows a person to take the next faithful step without needing to see the entire road. Perhaps this explains why some seasons of unanswered prayer eventually become seasons of profound transformation. The answer may still matter deeply, but while you are waiting, seeking, learning, and approaching doors, capacities can develop within you that could never have emerged through passive expectation. You may discover discernment while seeking direction, courage while approaching a difficult conversation, patience while waiting for an opportunity, or humility when the door you desperately wanted remains closed. Receiving, then, cannot always be reduced to acquiring the exact object originally requested. Sometimes what is received includes a new capacity to recognize which doors belong to your path and which doors you must finally stop trying to force open. That does not weaken the promise of Jesus. It protects the teaching from becoming a transaction and restores relationship, trust, responsibility, and movement to the center of prayer. The ancient pattern is therefore not ask harder until reality obeys. It is something more demanding. Ask honestly, seek attentively, knock courageously, and remain receptive to what the journey reveals. We are just scratching the surface of this ancient power. Get ready, because in our next video, I will reveal even deeper Aramaic codes that unlock spiritual authority you've never imagined. Make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on so you don't miss this unfolding revelation. Now only one step remains: turning these 3 ancient movements into something you can practice every day. Tomorrow morning, before entering the noise of the day, take 3 quiet minutes and practice the movement hidden inside Matthew 7:7. This is not a magical formula or a one-time prayer. It is a daily ritual for aligning your request, your attention, and your action. Begin with SHAL, pronounce SHAL, to ask, request, or inquire. Take one slow breath and identify one sincere request, not 10 competing desires. Then express clearly before God what you are seeking without exaggeration, fear, or desperation. Next, move into Bayu, pronounced Bayo, to seek, search, or pursue. Ask yourself where you should place your attention today, what wisdom you need to notice, and what small responsibility may already be pointing toward the answer you have requested. Finally, speak Kushu, pronounced Kushutanak. Choose one concrete action that brings you closer to the threshold. Make the call begin the work, seek reconciliation, ask the question, submit the application, or take whatever responsible step has been repeatedly postponed. Then release the outcome. That final movement matters because knocking is not breaking down the door. You participate through action while remaining humble enough to recognize that not every door must open and not every answer will arrive in the form you expected. Practice this pattern each morning for 7 days. Shall remind you to ask with clarity. Bayu reminds you to seek with attention. QUSH. You remind you to knock with courage. And whenever scarcity whispers, nothing is happening, return to the sequence instead of surrendering to fear. Ask yourself whether you are still merely requesting, whether you have begun seeking, and whether a door has already appeared that you are afraid to approach. This is how Matthew 7:7 moves from quotation into practice. The words of Jesus stop hanging passively on a wall and begin influencing the way you pray, notice, decide, and act. Just a quick reminder, the transformation guides for a fuller life are waiting for you right there in the comments. Before you leave, if this message touched your heart or brought new understanding into your life, write the word restoration in the comments below. Your testimony may encourage someone else who is seeking healing and renewal. Remember the progression. When tomorrow begins, do not ask from fear and then remain frozen in the same place. Ask with sincerity, seek with awareness, knock with courage, and remain open to an answer that may also transform the person receiving it. Thank you for sharing this moment of ancient wisdom with us. Until the next revelation, walk in peace, walk in freedom, and walk in the living movement of SHEAL, Bayu, and Kushu.